John, can you hear me? Well, thank you for all being here. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with a little bit of a somber news. So I was not supposed to be giving this presentation this week. John Zachary was supposed to be doing that, and he lost his mother unexpectedly Sunday night. So keep him in your thoughts and prayers. It was unexpected, and so he's dealing with a lot of different stuff this week, and it's quite sad. So, but with that said, he said, I'm going to try to do the presentation. We had one Tuesday, by the way, in Cary as well, too. And I said, no, you're not going to do that. If you know John, you know that he will always say yes, and he will absolutely do anything because he's just got a heart of gold. He's a great person with a real servant heart, and so we'll just be keeping him in your thoughts and prayers. But we wouldn't let him do the presentation, so I'm sorry that you're stuck with me, and I'm also sorry that you're stuck in here when it's really nice outside. So hopefully I won't run too long. The good thing is if you've been in my presentations, you know I talk for a really long time. This is John's presentation, and it's only half the amount of slides. So that's actually pretty good. Now I promise you it'll still be longer than if John had done it. So I did want to make a couple comments. So we do have a new teammate that has joined us now about a month and 2 months now. All right, 2 months. So this is Ruby in the back, and Ruby is our new client service associate, and she is working directly with Maggie. So we have grown. How many years you been here now, Maggie? Almost 8 this year coming up. 7, yeah, and so 8 in October. So. And we were pretty sure that we would need 2 Maggies about 6 years ago, but we haven't yet. And so she has been great for us, and this is really her first full-time hire to be supporting her as well, too. So Ruby, here's everybody. Everybody there's Ruby. She's great. I also just want to make a comment. I was thinking about the team, and we've got a lot of wonderful younger folks on our team now, and it's a real joy to be working with these folks. I know you don't see it on a day-to-day basis, but we've got some really smart people on the team, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, they are always trying to push the envelopes on finding new things that are out there, and you know, they don't have the years of experience that Rob and I have, but they definitely come with a really great fresh set of eyes, and they've got the heart that we love, which is always to challenge things. For those that don't know us as well, we came from a wirehouse, Morgan Stanley, Wall Street, and left because we are made to be independent, and it's just in us. And Wall Street works for Wall Street, and we work for our clients. And so the folks that are here on our team are that kind of mindset. It's a really fun team right now. So I just wanted to mention that. I know a lot of you have met individuals on the team, but we've got a fantastic team right now. And then also, I wanted to start, this is politics and taxes. It says taxes and politics, but I'm going to start the other way. So with a show of hands, I'm going to ask who you're going to vote for this year. Just kidding. So I always say, we had one time, a long time ago here at Morgan Stanley, a client stood up and asked for the vote of one of the presidents one year. Stood up in one of our things, I thought he had a question. Stood up and turned around to the audience and said, I'd like to ask your vote for this person for candidate. Please don't do that to us. So, we're going to try to keep, we're trying to keep a perspective that we want to have today, which is looking at politics from a market perspective, economic perspective. These are things that we want to look at. But I'd like to start first, and you think about it, because we're really trapped in this. What's the opposite of pro? Pro, right? So what's the opposite of progress? Progress. Sorry, you know how to have a bad joke in there somewhere. So, So thinking about politics here, I'm going to go through a couple of things that are pretty interesting. So number one, polls are already really close, probably too close to certainly to try to guess now. And this here, there's a good chance it's going to be contested again. I think that's a fear that people have, but there's a good chance that it's going to be contested again. And then this is always a fun stat if you didn't really think about it this way, but this is the first rematch election in almost 70 years in the country. So it doesn't happen very often, so I think that's also going to garner a lot of attention. It's too far to predict, but there are a few certain things. Presidential elections generally cause market volatility leading up to the election itself, and it will probably increase from here. Typically what we see in market volatility is that, and I want to try to maintain this perspective, and hopefully you take it with you, which is we are investing in businesses, right? And so when we're investing in businesses, we think about what those leaders of those organizations are trying to do, right? Well, first of all, they're trying to make money. And so, when you think about that, they want to know how to make money in the rules that they can play by in that particular industry. And so what happens when we think about elections is people question whether regulations or rules are going to change around them, and whether are they going to be able to make the right decisions depending on who's coming in, and is the environment going to change in which they operate. And I think about that, the quick example of sports, right? If you're about to go out and play a game, and then right before you go there, they put in somebody else that says, no, we're going to play the game a different way, right? This is how we're going to play it now. I think about like kids on a playground. Right? Whoever is sort of the leader of the group is going to tell you how to play that game that day, right? And it's kind of hard to think that, but that's sort of what politics is when it comes to the way business is perceiving elections. So, but as you can see here at the end, it says, but the markets tend to end the year positively, regardless of who gets in. And so what I would get you to think about is not Democrat and Republican, but rather uncertainty and certainty, right? So once somebody's elected, although I mentioned contested, I know that. Once somebody's elected, you sort of know what they're going to be pursuing, typically. And they typically will have more things than they will actually be able to accomplish. So you know that whatever the runway of items that they have that they're going to try to work through, they're not going to get all those, but you can start to see what kind of rules are going to be played, at least for the next, at least couple years, if not 4 years. So thinking about it like a business owner, and I'll give you some fun things. Who thinks that clean energy stocks have done better under Biden than they did under Trump? Right? It's the opposite. Clean energy stocks perform better under Trump than they have under Biden. That's probably the opposite of what you thought if you're going into the election, thinking, all right, what's going to happen here, right? I'm going to bet on clean energy if Biden wins. Well, it's the wrong choice, right? So just be mindful that it's sometimes hard to see that, and that's because it was leading up to that there was a lot of investment. And again, businesses are typically very far ahead. I made this comment in Cary. If you know anything about the RTP, you've heard Apple and Amazon were going to be coming, right? And this is years in the making. And I always think about that these decisions that businesses are making, they don't care who's going to be in office this go round, because they're making a long-term investment decision for their business. Right? Amazon did not expand into Raleigh, Garner area with their distribution facilities because of who was in the county and commission in Wake County that year. Right now, I think local politics, particularly state and county and stuff like that, have some very opportunistic things for businesses in the way of tax breaks. Right, so that can shape the decisions that businesses are making, but typically that's not actually on the federal level. Right, those are typically more on a local or state level. So just getting your mindset around thinking about we are investors and we want to know what the businesses are doing, not necessarily what the politics are doing. And I particularly would say, we're not going to talk about the social dynamics out there, right? Because businesses don't really care about the social dynamics either. Maybe some businesses do because that's the way they've crafted their business. But in general, it's who's going to make money. And I'll give you an example here. I don't love this example. because it's a tragedy. But there was a school shooting down in Texas that we all know about and we heard about, right? And that shooting was absolutely horrific. Well, I'm the school board of my daughter's little school, and everybody was up in arms. They wanted to know the safety protocols. They wanted to know what we were doing. I mean, people, you talk about building walls. These parents wanted to build a wall around that school, right? But what my point on this is that we went through, we actually brought in the police and the SBI. We did an assessment, and we went back through and we spent money on new security cameras, new things to change the door features, and a bunch of money was spent after that. So that tragedy put some money in the pockets of some companies that are in the safety business. Simply put, it was a tragedy, it was terrible, but somebody made money off of it. Other things, I always make this comment, so Katrina hit New Orleans, and more money went into New Orleans after Katrina than New Orleans was supposedly worth before Katrina. Right, with all the reinsurance money and the federal money and everything that went into there, a lot of money went to rebuilding New Orleans, and it was actually supposedly spent more money in there than it was worth to start off with. So just be mindful as well, as even if you think about those kind of things, that the way that business operates isn't necessarily the way that we would think from a moral or even a human perspective, right? There's somebody solving a problem, and some of those problems are pretty bad problems, but somebody wants to make money, and we're actually glad that they're coming up with solutions like that, right? And you hear the stories too. It's someone who was affected by a tragedy is the one who developed the company that's now the one, and they're making all kinds of money because they had a tragedy in their life. So just think about those kind of things when you think about your portfolio, is that these businesses aren't wrapped up a lot in their shorter term things. And of course, this is just reiterating it. They don't have a lot of impact on the long-term direction of the market. There's been there's a lot of legislation that's been passed, but there's been three major pieces of legislation that I could think of in the last, whatever that is, 4 presidencies. So when President Obama was elected, he had both the House and the Senate. So he got Dodd-Frank passed and he got the Affordable Care Act passed. When Trump got in, he had control for the first couple of years, and he got his Tax Cuts and Jobs Reconciliation Act passed. Biden really hasn't had that power, so he hasn't gotten any major legislation like those 3 pieces of legislation. So those are your 3 biggest pieces of legislation. And if you were thinking about the Affordable Care Act, for example, everybody said that's the death of the private sector. And instead, if you look at what healthcare stocks did from the time that was enacted until the next 10, 12 years, healthcare sector was your high-flying, best-performing sector. So again, these are things where, and particularly, would you guess 10 years? Because 10 years later, people weren't even thinking about that anymore. So again, just be mindful that that's it. So where are we this year as far as the Congress goes? We talked about the presidency. So here we've got, of course, the House. Every single seat is up in the House. But in the Senate, we've got 20 up for grabs for the Democrats. We've got 10 up for grabs for the Republicans, and we've got 3 up for grabs for the Independents. And that's 3 out of 3, by the way. So does anybody know the biggest party in America now? Actually, that's not a party, right? It's the unaffiliated, I guess, is what I would say. So they're not really a party. That's the biggest population. I was looking at Gallup polls and tracking it the last couple years just to see where people are. And I think the low point was about 38% of the population identified as independent. And probably the high point, I think, was like 47, 48. So they're doing that monthly, and you can see the stats. And so I think right now it was pretty high. It was like 43 or 44%. But guess what? Because it's not a party, we don't have independent candidates that are getting voted in. We just have a greater unknown about where the election's going because so many people don't want to identify with one party or another. So that's a pretty interesting take on the politics today as well too. And that trend's been happening. That's been increasing for years and years and years and years that we've got this going on. So this is what we're looking at for this year, and Republicans have a slight advantage in the Senate right now, but they have less seats up for grabs. And then here, Republicans right now still have the House, but all those seats are up for grabs. So just some perspective there. Timeline, chronologically, what's coming up? Well, we've got 2 national conventions, and that's where we officially get candidates. Although I just started the presentation and told you it's probably too close to call already. And I mean, we actually don't have any candidates yet, officially. So, but I'm pretty sure what we're going to get is Trump and Biden at these 2 conventions. All the pageantry that goes with that and everything else that goes in. But that's when we will have formal candidates and vice president candidates as well, too, which is something. We'll see what comes out. Then we have debates. There haven't been as many debates for these 2 people this year. But we're going to have 2 candidates for 3 debates, 90 minutes each. We snuck it in, or at least they'll be trading insults. I don't know if they'll actually be debating. If you pay attention to state politics, I love one of the things that the state does is they bring these candidates through and they give them 20 minutes in front of the reporter and the camera on public TV, and they ask them basically the same questions, and when they're done, that person leaves, the next person comes in. So there is no debate. It's just those people sitting there getting asked the same questions. Wow, it's amazing, right? And so I really, I can't stand debates, I'll be honest with you. It's the same thing I can't stand watching Real Housewives. That's the way I feel about it today. And so I feel like that's, that's always something that it's a big one, and it does get people talking and focused. So that will happen again. But I just wanted to mention the last one too. That's the vice presidential candidates will also have their debate once as well. November 5th is Election Day. November 5th now is probably going to have a lot of voting already completed by that time. As we know, there's early voting. That's in their mail-in ballot initiatives that are out there. So a lot of people are already voting before the election now. I see that trend just continuing and continuing. There's a lot of reasons, but you think about the way people work today, and people can work remote. So it's an interesting dynamic where we are with the voting, but I kind of see that continuing. I have voted early before because I was going on a trip and it was really convenient and I loved it. It's also fun because I feel like I don't have to bring my kid there on election day, but she can go with me to vote and see what that process is like, which is fun. So I've done it myself, and I think there's a lot of people that are going to continue to do that. Result certification. So we've got a 2-month gap in here. And so we all remember what happened before and when they stormed the Capitol and basically said that they were trying to stop the certification of Biden. So this part we are hoping does not happen again. I will say that this feels a lot like what happened after 9/11 to me, is that we all started going through different airport securities and the security got ramped up. As many people that have asked me about this or worried about this or whatever you want to say about this, I'm going to guess that the government is also keen that is a possibility too. And so I think you're going to see a lot different level of security than you had before. So I would just be mindful that generally speaking, things don't happen twice the same way in the same format. So I think it's a little bit misleading to think that could even happen that way again. And then we will get a newly re-elected president. One of them. So in January 20th. So it's going to be a long cycle here of politics, and I encourage you all to not watch any of it on TV, but instead do your homework, do your research, and try not to let it emotionally get in the way of how you feel about your investments But I will tell you now, I think there will be increased volatility. You start watching, there are a lot of traders in our business, right? Traders don't have a long-term investment mindset. So when you watch the news, which tries to sensationalize everything, people will make bets on that, and traders will bet. We actually, many of you own a fund, one of our small cap funds, which we've owned for a long time, it's absolutely outstanding. It's a fantastic fund, and actually they trade based on behavior, right? And so they do track things like this, like what's happening in the news and stuff like that. That's not our game. Our game is to invest with the manager who does that. Right, where I'm not going to watch the news and guess which way something's going, but there are people that do that, and that causes volatility, and then they're out. They don't care. Right, so it's not an investment in the long run. So just be mindful of that as well, too. Summary slide, maybe, is the way I could say this. So markets don't really care. They care a little bit about what legislation is being proposed or what regulations are being proposed. And then after that, these people are back to business. They want to make money. They want to figure out what's going to happen, and they're worried about labor markets, and they're worried about supply chain, and they're worried about customers, and they're worried about sales, and all that other stuff. Here's an interesting slide. What this shows is on the left side, on our vertical axis, we have annualized stock performance. So the higher, the better, if you like great stock performance. I think we could all agree on that one. On our horizontal axis, what we have is GDP in the United States. So Trump had high performance of the stock market, but pretty low GDP in America. Right? GW, down here in the corner, he had negative stock market performance. As you remember, he left at the end of 2008, which was the Great Recession. So, he had negative investment returns, and so did Nixon, if you remember that as well, too. That was the oil embargo. That happened as well. So those two, they left office when things were negative. So the GDP was here and the stock market was here. You see on the other end, Kennedy was out here, had great economic growth, but the stock market performance wasn't fantastic, but growth in the country was. So just to give you an idea of perspective on that, and then you see the two guys sort of in the middle, or in this group in here. We'll just go with that time frame, and that time frame is 80s and 90s. We had great stock market performance and great GDP growth. So I know we could sit here and argue back and forth which one of those caused that, and I'm going to kind of just highlight again that probably neither one of them. So what I would show you here is that no matter which party you think is doing it, they have all done it. It all goes up, right? Unless you happen to stop in 2008, right there when it was down, right, like Bush did. Besides that, why is that? Because the stock market is a bunch of businesses trying to grow and sell stuff, and we love to buy stuff. And so because of that, we get economic growth, which turns into profit for businesses, and that in itself means that whoever's president, if you stack it up against the stock market, everybody looks good. And there are a lot of arguments and nuances and things like that I'm not going to get into, but on a very high level, everybody's done pretty well. And if you want to just take these two that are up for election, this is what they have done since they got in. Of course, Trump's out, but this is Biden versus Trump in the same time frame. So if you started here at the same point with Trump and Biden, basically, what has the stock market done while they've been in office this long? So interesting. Trump's a little bit outperformance than Biden, but both pretty good. This slide is interesting as well. So it's two sides. One, this is 10 years, and this is 70. So what this says is if you want to only invest when your party's in, so here you invested, Democrats were in, you rode it out because you got out of the market and stuck your money under the mattress because you didn't want those Republicans to touch your money. And then it started going up, and then the Republicans were in, and then they said, oh no, here comes the Democrats, and they got out and stuck it under the mattress, right? This is what you'd have if you had just stayed invested the whole time. I'll take the whole time one. Right. And if you go to 70 years, that's obviously exaggerating here, but I really would rather have the everybody time frame, right? There's no way that you could talk me out of going backwards in time and not investing during Reagan and Clinton. Right? There's just no way. Right? If you said whatever reason politically that you would not invest during one of those time frames, right? Then that's fantastic for you, but you're going to be working a lot longer than everybody else is. Right? Because the 401ks nowadays, those are pretty 20 years of great growth, both decades. And then we get into election cycles, so I just want to highlight this too. So all years, stock market averages 10.3%, and this is since the 20s, so it is a long time frame. But then you break that down a little bit more. Election years aren't so bad. They're actually better than average. So I think I mentioned volatility coming, and there's no cycle that's going to be exactly like the last one. But the idea here is don't fear elections themselves and try to relate that to the market performance. It's not a correlation that you should try to make. Right? It just isn't. And here, non-election years, odd years, first year and third year, those are the best performing. And a lot of times I would say I go back to if someone has the White House and the Senate and the House, they can usually get some big pieces of legislation passed, and then that can significantly push something in the right direction from a financial perspective, right? So if the government says they want to do this, and they've got control of Congress and the White House, they can usually get something passed, they can do that. And then they get to channel where the spending is. I mentioned the contested elections. Here are the two that we've had, 2000 and 2020. And again, if you said, contested election, got to get out. Well, it's not the case either. So here was a contested election that we went through with Trump and Biden. There's positive results. Here, this is back in the day when Florida had to do the recount and stuff with Gore, and that was negative. So is it because it was contested? Probably not. So again, I don't know that I would necessarily hang my hat on the fact that it might be contested, so I'm going to worry more about what's going to happen in the stock market. A few other things that you're probably thinking about besides elections, which is debt, interest rates, inflation, Social Security, geopolitical issues and wars in there, and then taxes, which we'll talk about in this section. So let's talk about the debt first. So here's the U.S., middle of the pack here, but it's definitely higher debt as a percentage of our GDP, and so we've crept up to 100% essentially. And what I would mention about that is, and I've said it before, but if you have $100,000 and you buy a $400,000 mortgage, it's acceptable, right? You pay it off over 30 years. What if somebody said you had forever to pay that mortgage off? Right? Then you'd say, well, maybe I could even borrow more. Okay? They're going to give me how long? Forever. Indefinite. Right? Longer than you. Right? So that's what the U.S. has. What the U.S. has, as long as that we're around, we can pay our debt back. Right? And so the other thing that's interesting is that when we got to $100,000 on a $100,000 income, and we got a $100,000 mortgage, everybody started getting upset because our debt level was matching our GDP, which is scary. But if I put it on a personal basis, it seems a lot more reasonable, right? Now, what do we all hope if you take a mortgage? Two things happen. One, you lock in your rate, right? So a lot of people like fixed. So if you lock in your rate, then you know what your payment's going to be. And what's the other thing that happens over 30 years? You hope you get a raise, right? So what do we hope in our country is we hope we have GDP growth. We hope that we get a raise. GDP growth, some could argue that's inflation. So we need some inflation, we need some growth, we need all that together. And we also need to pay our debt. Now what we don't have is we don't have a fixed rate indefinitely. And so I'm not actually as worried about the level of debt as I am worried about the variable rates and the ability to pay our interest. So this is where we get into the interest only, if you want to argue that part of it. But if I think about what we have, and there's a slide in here, the high levels of debt will tend to change the way the government spends, typically. So the high public debt levels are associated with slower growth. Why slower growth? Because the government isn't spending as much money. So they don't have as much wiggle room. Higher interest rates, which we've had, and higher inflation, which we've had. So these are things that don't necessarily bode well economically, but we didn't want to let those go out of control. So higher rates to fight higher inflation. Growth is actually pretty decent still. And that's why the Fed has said we're going to keep rates higher for longer, because we are worried just as much about the growth as we are the other side of that, which is going into recession if they keep that gap too big. So right now, the Fed has raised rates above inflation because inflation fell. And I talked about that in our January one, but basically we got a little blip with inflation, which we'll say, but actually, sorry, I didn't show you my slides for what I was talking about. Here's our debt from an average interest rate. So our interest rate went really, really low, and now you've seen it spike back up. So that's what I'm talking about as far as the variable rate goes. And then here is the amount of payments that we're going to have to make is that blue. John threw the orange slide up there, which is the percent of GDP on defense spending. So our interest payment has actually exceeded our defense spending. It's the expectations. Like right now, we've already crossed it, but it's expected that it's going to go higher. So that's what I was mentioning about the interest payment. And here, which party is more fiscally responsible? I would say the one that's not in office at the time. Because they're not spending any money. So if you're in office, you spend money. Apparently, is what happens here. So nobody is without a piece of the puzzle of getting our debt higher and higher and higher. And there's reasons. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we shouldn't have spent debt or we should have spent debt. What I'm simply saying is like this is the growth. And everybody, when I walked down the line, whoever was in office, all the debt went up under each party control. And there's never a negative in there. Fed rate cuts though, if we get over the hump and inflation has gone down, then the Fed is talking about, and we actually expected to, at the beginning of the year, expected to start seeing those the second half of the year. Although the market was anticipating those at the beginning of the year. If you were here in January, I mentioned that. I think it'll be later on. I think inflation is going to be higher for longer. So far, that's been right. So the market didn't like that at first. Particularly the bond market was nervous that we were going to get deflationary. I think it's a good point because I get this question, how they calculate inflation and all that kind of stuff. And what I would remind people is inflation is not price itself. Inflation is the growth of prices. So what I mean by that is if you buy your favorite shirt and it's $20 and that shirt goes to $30 and then stays there for 10 years. So we had a 50% inflation rate that first year, and then we've had 0% inflation for 10 years. That shirt has never gone back down to $20, right? And I think that's something that I think is a little misleading because we hear, well, I mean, Jason, there's obvious inflation. You know, do you see the price of this or price of that? And I'm like, yeah, I do. But that doesn't mean there's inflation, right? There was inflation last year. that was really bad from the year before. And so that's why we're paying the prices we pay today. But inflation, the growth rate of prices is not the same that it was a year and a half, 2 years ago. Now, if you have not bought something in 5 years and you go to buy it for the first time again, you will feel inflation. I'll give you an example, right? And there are people in this room that said, wow, Jason, why didn't you just claim on your insurance that new roof that you just paid for? And I don't want to show of hands on this one, but I know there are people in this room that somehow some roofer came by, climbed up on the roof, found out that there was something that hit Isaias, whatever that one was, Florence. I think somebody even called that Fran may have got something on their roof. So, and Fran was 96, by the way. So everybody was getting free roofs except for Jason. And have you seen the price of a roof? So if you really want to see inflation, like that's it. So for me, inflation was really bad on a roof, right? Guess what else? We all are feeling the inflation on the insurance, right? So people say, oh, they raised yours too? It's not only if you make a claim. No, I'm helping pay for everybody else's roof, and I paid for my own, right? So those are two things that are sticky, particularly in this area. And so that inflation's real. Probably not going to see the roof prices go tremendously backwards. Right? We don't have deflation. We still have some inflation. So just be mindful of that. But if growth does slow, and we say, look, I just can't afford that anymore, then we get slower growth. And if we get slower growth, then the Fed is more likely going to cut interest rates, which is what they had anticipated we'd have already seen. But we haven't, because the economy's been strong. Stronger than expected, I should say. And so because of a stronger economy, Fed's keeping rates higher, and now there's a gap, let's call it maybe 2%, between inflation and where the Feds are keeping the rates. How long do they do that before that starts hurting us? And that's TBD, is did they keep rates too high for too long? And I can't answer that question right now. It always feels when we're in it that they might be doing the right thing. And there's an old saying, don't fight the Fed, but that's not about whether they push us in a recession or not. Because out of like 11 times, they put us in a recession 9 by keeping rates too high too long. So we're going to see. But I will say that inflation has gone down, which is great for all of us. And so it will to be determined, but the market is still pricing in a couple interest rate cuts by the end of this year because they anticipate slower growth. And then over here, when Fed does cut, stocks really do well if there's not a recession with it. So, I mean, if you push us into a recession, then that's a little different impact. And I'm not saying that you need to time that. What I'm saying is the difference between having a bad 5.6 year and having a positive 21% year is probably not worth it if I say, where's your money going to be in 5 years? Who cares about the next one, right? So that's a pretty good trade-off there. If I think about the stock market, that's 30% and negative 10, 12, something like that. It's like a normal 1 standard deviation. You get out 2 standard deviations and we're talking about 47% and negative 20%. That's the normal range of stocks 95% of the time. So that's the trade-off that we would expect. Here's the inflation that I was mentioning, and the black line is the Fed funds rate, and the blue line's inflation. This little bump back up is why we don't see the Fed cutting rates. It's why we the stock market was doing well and the bond market, and then everything had kind of changed again because we're like, wait, where are we? I mentioned in January, I think the one thing the market was not expecting was whether or not inflation went back up, and we've seen some of that, and I still think that. I think we saw it last week. I know with everything going on in the Middle East, there was a lot of thoughts that maybe the market was based on that, and there's a little bit of that, but that's the reason that the market first started going down a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago was because of inflationary data. And so I think people are worried that the Fed will keep rates too high too long if inflation's too high, right? And so they're basically that full circle here. They're worried that they're going to push us into a recession because of that. And again, it's people guessing too far in advance. We won't know if we're in a recession for like 18 months after the quarter that we're measuring anyway, because the way the government does it. So it's always a funny thing to do. Another big topic that we've heard, because if you don't know this, the government began drawing down Social Security trust funds in 2021. They changed the formula. There's probably people in this room that like their Social Security checks. There's probably some people in this room that wonder if they're going to get them. Right? That's why, because current projections expect that those funds will run out in 2033. But luckily for our young people, they don't send Social Security statements anymore. So nobody actually reads that. Right? So that's the easiest way, is just be oblivious to it. At that time, unless something is done to mitigate, Social Security payments would have to decrease by 25 to 28% in order to be sustainable. So it's like me buying a roof and not getting my insurance. Anybody want to go ahead and like send back 25% of your Social Security now and help us out? No? So this is an issue that can be resolved, and quite frankly, no one wants to touch it. Hasn't become dire enough. And so I think they're just waiting. I turned 50 this year. I think they're just waiting for me. So if you know me long enough, I started with Rob in 1999, which was the top of the market. And the market went down for 3 years after I got into this profession. Same thing's going to happen with Social Security, right? I'm ready to claim, and they're going to say, no, we're cutting it. We're cutting it. So you're probably fine for a while. Potential solutions are, and I've got a book in my office somebody wrote 15 years ago, 17 ways to solve Social Security. There are lots of ways to solve Social Security. No one's wanted to touch it. Does anybody know the last president who said he wanted to fix it? GW. Bush was the last president who said he wanted to do that. He put it in his campaign speeches and all that type of stuff, and did not become the president. Right? What he said, I was at a convention where he was the speaker. He was actually fantastic. And this was, John's not here, but he was talking about Putin back those days. I mean, that was a long time ago, and he was talking a lot about Putin back then, and it's here we are still. But one thing that he mentioned is when your party does not agree with the big initiative you're trying to solve, say if you can't get your own people to do it, he said you're not going to win. And he said it was a big mistake that he made was to try to touch Social Security. And we are 20 years later, and no one has wanted to touch it since. And so I don't think it's going to be touched, but I do think it's going to become. At some point, it's going to be like our debt ceiling arguments, I bet, in this country. So it's going to be interesting, but it's coming, just not immediate. And then there's a lot of stuff going in the world. This is created before that was Israel and Iran, right? And so you could argue there's another crisis already that's happened in this time frame. And there's a lot of real human issues around this. You could argue some of the economic things, but I'm going to put some things in perspective that are back to that statement I mentioned at the beginning, which tragedy is not necessarily bad for business. There's money being spent on weapons and planes and tanks and all kinds of stuff like that. There is healthcare expenses associated with that. There is aid-based expenses to go along with that. There's a lot of money being spent in that kind of stuff, which we've all heard about that as well too. The other side that I wanted to mention though is how much of our growth in our country is, or your portfolios for that matter, is affected by what happens in Iran. Well, maybe a little bit in the United States, but your portfolio is zero. They're not adding to the growth of your portfolio. We're not investing in Iranian companies, right? So it's a weird one to think that way. But even I remember when Greece went bankrupt, right? Everybody was worried about Greece and this country was going to fail. It's like Greece added 0.17% to the world GDP, right? So it's kind of a weird way to look at that. So I'm not saying totally dismiss it. There's a lot of other things around there, and certainly as a human, it's mind-blowing. But as far as financial implications on the portfolio, that's why inflation was more of a rock to the markets the last week and a half than this was. So kind of a crazy way to look at it. Issues could lead to volatility, but they are very unpredictable. Therefore, it's difficult, not typically wise to make investment decisions based on them. I mean, that in itself, what are you going to bet? Are you going to bet that they are going to go to war? They're not going to go to war? If you did get that right, then what? Right. Oh, they are going to go to war. So now what? Well, now I'm going to invest this way. That's a weird kind of train of thought to go. I think maybe a diversified, boring, old school portfolio might get you just through fine, which is what we want to do. All right, so that's politics. And there's a lot going on. It's going to be, in the summary, it's going to cause volatility. So expect it for the rest of the year. It's going to ramp up probably, but generally speaking, politics themselves in the United States elections typically don't cause bad markets after it's over. The other big topic today, which is a little shorter, I don't have as many slides, luckily. That was a weird round of applause. I don't remember that. But I do have another bad joke. So, do you know the difference between death and taxes? Congress doesn't meet once a year to make death any worse. All right, sorry. Told you, Pop. I went in there yesterday. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot my jokes. I was like, oh, I remembered. And he's like, I don't have any doubt that you're going to remember a joke. So, so a couple things, and this is more tactical on your financial lives, which is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is basically, let's call it the Trump tax package, right? So when that came through, we had the current rates here, and then we have this reverting because that had a sunset provision in it. So Trump's tax package said, yes, we're going to pass it, but it sunsets at this time. That was really the way that they could get it passed through. So, and by the way, that was when he had control, House, Senate, and the White House, and he still had a sunset in it. Interesting. So I just highlight a couple things. Oh, man. There we go. That's an important dynamic. So 10% stays 10%, and the ranges stay the same. The 12%, though, jumps to the 15%. So if you're making more than $23,000, the same range of income, but you're getting a 3% increase in your personal tax rates. Now, we can talk about the 37% and the 39.6. If we want to talk about that end of it, I'm comfortable with that, and you can see what's happening is this person's getting 2.6% more, that person's getting 3% more. So if you kind of remember that argument, there's a big argument, like was it 250, and then it was going to tax everybody over 400, and then like Mitt Romney had some plan, like all those discussions about draw the line, where's rich and where's poor, basically is what they were trying to say. And when I look at this, there's a couple things that jump out. So the ranges go down. So if this sunsets, if you're making 200, you go from 22 to 25, but then you jump up. Now you're in this bracket. So you actually go from 22 to 28 if you're making 200. So there's a lot of movement in here. And so it can cause a lot of tax issues. So this is something that we all need to be mindful of, which is why it's going to be a topic in this election coming up, and certainly whoever gets in. And I'll give you an example of why I think that something will have to be done. And this is a single worker who makes $60,000 a year, takes the standard deduction, which last year was $13,800. After subtracting the standard deduction, her income is reduced to 46. So that becomes her taxable income. First 11,000 is taxed at 10%, income between 11 and 44 is taxed at 12, and then this other 2,000-ish, 1,500 is taxed at 22%. She makes it into the 22, but only between those two numbers. So that's her tax bill, $54.60. If they don't do anything at all, it's jumping to $72.54. So she's getting a tax increase of $1,800 or $150 a month. So, and I know everybody in this room, and I'm amazed. I see people who make a ton of money. I don't know how they don't have more money, and I see people who have living off nothing, and they have all kinds of money. So we see all kinds of stuff from people. There is no rhyme or reason. But I will tell you that no matter what party you sit in here, or if you're independent or whatever, like nobody was really thinking that this tax package was about this person. This wasn't the person that we talked about with the tax package. And so, if you're running for office, is this the person you're going to say needs to pay more taxes? I'm going to say no, right? So that isn't the person that anybody's going to stake claim on. So because of that, and the fact that they sunset no matter what, there will be a big discussion coming up around this. And a couple scenarios. One, if the Democrats don't do anything, taxes go up, which they weren't happy with this tax package, so they could let it sunset, but then they'd be putting a higher tax rate on people that don't make as much income, which isn't one of the things that they claim. Republicans, on the other hand, they want to lock this in if they can, so it depends on if they have enough power to do that. They would probably try to make what we have permanent, right? Which isn't going to solve that, if I go back to the big debt button and look at that one. So there's a lot of issues going on, and it probably will be somewhere in between, but I do think that people are going to have to make a change in Congress around our taxes. I don't believe that they will probably do it, and I'm going to, this is just a wild hair here, but I'm going to guess that 2026 will start with sunsetted taxes and we will revert, and sometime between January of 26 and December 31st of 26, something will get passed. And it'll become very politicized, and Congress will be all over our news, and they'll be interviewing, and they will be talking about this endlessly, but they will get something done before the end of the year, is my guess. So this is another one, and again, this feels, for a lot of people, why are you even showing this, Jason? It does impact some people, but just the drastic nature of this is that the gift and estate tax exemption, if a couple has $27.2 million before they pay estate tax in our country right now, that's going to 14. Some people say, well, that should be enough, 14, right? But let me just kind of give you a perspective. The difference in that is taxed at 50%, let's call it. So that would have gone to their family, so they're going to care about that, right? Now, when I started in the business, that number was $650,000. So anything above $650,000 was taxed starting at 45 and quickly going to 55%. So if you had been lucky enough to buy a house on Wrightsville Beach for a summer cottage in 81 or something like that, you're there if they hadn't changed the laws. Well, the laws changed. They've changed many times since then. It went from 650 to $1 million. Then they had a little bit of inflation. Then they jumped it up to 3.5, and they grew that. Then they put it at 5 million with some inflation, and then that was growing. And then the couple was each, and then it became like 11. It grew up into like 12ish, and then Trump said we're going to double it, and so then it doubled, and so now went from 24 up to 27. So it has grown a lot over the years, this estate tax, but it is reverting, and this was a big topic. So when they do the tax package, I would just be mindful that there were people who wanted to repeal this totally, no exemption. I think Bernie Sanders was 3.5 for a couple, to give you some perspective on that. So there's a lot. So again, little items that go in here, when they renegotiate taxes, all this stuff comes back. So this is already going here, but it's probably something that's going to be talked about. Other things that would happen, so standard deduction was doubled, so that would go backwards. Personal exemptions were repealed because they doubled the standard. But now for all of you who are no longer keeping all your receipts and doing all that kind of stuff, we might be going back to itemized, right? Because those were limited. Child tax credit was doubled. Right, so I don't think that that's particularly an area that everybody wants to say, oh, by the way, let's take the tax credit away. Well, it goes away, or it cuts in half. Possible that the changes get extended or new ones get passed. That's something we're going to watch. I love this. Tax reform is when you take the taxes off things that have been taxed already and put taxes on things that haven't been taxed before. That's funny. Sorry. See, their jokes are better than my jokes, aren't they? These are safe for now. One particular one that I mentioned is the step up in basis. Step up in basis right now, the way that works is if you pass away, your assets get a step up, your kids inherit anything that's not in a retirement account, so your house, your portfolio that's not in the IRA, all that gets a step up. Your kids inherit it at that value, so there's no tax when your kids get that, or whoever. This also works for spouses. So if one spouse passes in a joint account, let's just say, then let's say this is their basis and their portfolio's up here. This is the gap here. Well, this one gets stepped up with one of the spouses. So half of the joint account would get a step up in basis. Right? And so just to note that. So step up in basis. Without that, then basically inheritance, it has not an estate tax, but has this capital gain tax in there as well too. So this is one that feels like it's safe right now, but could be a negotiating point. And these other two were all on the chopping. So all of these were very much contested topics in the last discussion about reform. And then this mega backdoor Roth, both of these are strategies that are for accumulators, and both of those have been on the chopping block, but right now they're safe. It's probably not a lot that most of the people in here would do, but this is really for the working folks. But again, I've got a young, awesome team of advisors and stuff, so if you've got kids that are looking for somebody to help them, send them our way. Good news. Just remind everybody, right? Innovation is like the key of what we do in investing, right? I mean, this is what gets exciting. This is why we invest, because there's new solutions for the future. There's a new company coming along, or there's a company that's reinvented something, right? And so when I think about this, none of this stuff was here that long ago. Smart, this doesn't say phones, it says smart homes, right? Somebody reminded me, I don't know if you were in the presentation I did a few years back about technology and healthcare, and all the stuff that was coming out, like when you step out of the bed, the lights come on automatically. You walk into your bathroom and it scans your vital signs in your mirror and sends them directly to your doctor. Contact lenses that track your not only your blood pressure, but other vital things and stuff like that. So there's so many things that were out there. And I gave that presentation maybe 7 or 8 years ago. So just to kind of think through that. But you see this stuff that's out here, cloud computing, fitness trackers, electric vehicles, gene editing, artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there. And as much as you might worry about it, it's changing the way that we live, and somebody's making some bucks off of it, right? And as investors, it makes us happy. Right? We want to be a part of those things. We don't want to miss out. And so virtual home assistant sounds nice. I got turned on, and I don't know if some people might not love this, but somebody told me to watch this show, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Has anybody watched this show? It's the guy who came up with Seinfeld. Right. Larry David, that's right. So I had never watched it. It's in its final season right now. And my friends say, you got to watch this show. So I put my daughter to bed. I walk downstairs, turn on the TV. I'm like, all right, I'm going to watch this show. So I watch it, and the first thing he does, he like walks out to his car. He sits in his car. He starts talking to Siri. And if you haven't seen this episode, Siri doesn't respond well to his direct. He's like, I need to go to here. And they're like, this place? It's like, no, not that place. You mean this place? No. You want to call such and such? Oh, I don't want to call. I want direction. You can just see his frustration start building up. He's yelling at Siri and going back and forth. And it's just profanity after profanity after profanity. And I'm crying, laughing, because I can just see how many people have been in that situation before, right? And then all of a sudden, I'm like, my daughter is upstairs. I hope she can't hear all of this stuff. And instead of just turning it off and waiting, I just turned it down because I was laughing so much at this guy being frustrated with Siri. And so if you've ever been frustrated with Siri, I think about this personal assistant thing. So that stuff is funny, but really it's making a difference. I was at a competition for my daughter, and there was a bunch of 8th graders who developed a software that bought facial recognition software lease. And they developed a software program that if you were blind, by sound, you could make facial expressions, and it would teach kids, if they were blind, what the difference between a smile and a frown and an anger sign are. Because they don't learn that because they can't see. So they can be joyful but not know what a smile looks like. And so this was a way to teach kids, young kids, by sound how to do that. And it would read it to them, it would explain it to them as well, not just, but it would track them. If they smiled, it would go, and it would let them know they were doing it right. It's crazy. So, I mean, that's just and that was 8th graders developing that. And this is the last slide, so you can get back outside and enjoy. Stick to your plan. Remind yourself of your long-term goals and financial plan. Base your decisions on your financial objectives rather than short-term political events. And I mean, at the end of the day, I've been saying this a lot lately because it's just resonated with our team and our clients and everything else like that. Which is people don't run out of money, they run out of time and health. So there you go. So I don't really, if you follow our advice, we've been doing it through some pretty crappy times for the last, 20, I've been working with Rob for 25 years now, and we've been through the Great Recession, we've been through 9/11, we've been through COVID, we've been through all kinds of stuff together with a lot of you in this room, and I thank you very much for that. People didn't run out of money unless they overspent or did something silly. Market didn't take it away from them. So just remember that, don't get caught up. Stay diversified. It's just a mantra. We purposely take risk off the table. And you don't need to make as much money. I didn't put this one in here because it's John's presentation, but I've got one. Some of you have seen it. If you don't lose the money, you don't have to make it back up, right? So it doesn't feel good to be diversified. Somebody's probably seen that in my office. If you have, I got a slide that says it's no fun to be diversified. Because in the good markets, you never feel like you're keeping up with the stock market. Right? Oh, I'm not making as much money. And in the down market, you're still losing money. Right? You're not losing as much, but you don't care. I always give this example. $1 million and you're down 16%, the stock market's down 38%. You don't say, wow, that's awesome, Pathfinder, I'm only down 16%. You go, I'm down $160,000. Right? And then when it goes up, the market's up 38%, you're only up 16, and what do you say? I'm only up 16%. Now you're up 160 grand. Oh yeah, but the market's up. I'd be up 380 grand. So again, it's not fun to be diversified, but by the way, it works. And if you look at that over 20, 25 years, you can accomplish your goals without taking the same level of risk. Avoid emotional stuff, avoid market timing, and then consider your risk tolerance. So I say this, we studied as a team a while back. It was trying to identify whether your client was going to be biased by a logical perception or whether it was an emotional perception of something that was happening. And if someone was more affected by their emotions, then the goal was then to find a common ground and accommodate. And if the person was more logical, then it was to provide a solution, and then you could try to overcome that objection. So in other words, and I'll take it, here's the election coming up. I don't like such and such, I think they're going to win. Okay, why? Well, here's what's going to happen, very logical, blah, 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 blah. Well, let's talk about this, and let's look at data, and let's figure this out. Okay, I'm going to stay put. Right? The person who's very emotional about that, probably I would argue irrational about it to some degree, that person would say, okay, you know what? You might be right. Right? Which is great marital advice. You might be right. And so you move from 60% to 50%. You don't go from 60% to 0%. But that 60 to 50 makes that person feel like they took some action, they accommodated that, and then we feel good that we're not going to all of a sudden miss out on a bunch of money if the market turns around on them. Or if they're wrong and it never has that dip that they're worried about. So again, these are things here. So just consider your risk tolerance. Talk to us. We hear it all. We hear it all. And so if you have some kind of fear, bring it to us. And we would need to talk through it and make a decision on that. And then take a break. That's the big one, right? Just turn off the news. If you're getting emotional about something, just go outside. Do whatever you need to do to get away from it. It's really a good strategy. That might be way up at the top, actually. So, all right. So that's taxes and politics, and I appreciate everybody being here. If anybody has any questions,
yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. In your opening remarks, you were talking about summarizing economic activity under legislation under previous presidents, Obama and Trump, but you couldn't think of anything that had happened significantly for President Biden, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the infrastructure bill and the ChFC bill.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's not some of those things. I'm just saying as far as major, big enacted one, and those are moving stuff. I mean, we just spent at $1.something billion to be competitive in the chip business. So there are some things that are moving, and so, but as far as major industry changing, I don't know that we're going to say yet on those being finalized, because the stuff that was proposed was all watered down by the time those bills came through. And so the level that those were supposed to come through, I think you could have argued that those would have been game changer, but I don't think they were at the same level. I'm not saying they're not going to impact it. I said there's a lot of legislation that got passed, right? There's a lot of stuff that happened. And there's definitely nuances throughout that. But as far as Dodd-Frank changed the financial industry. Affordable Care Act changed the healthcare industry. And so there's things like that. That tax package was wide sweeping across everything. Whereas, with the chip stuff, for example, there are some fundamentals that are going to change parts of it, but it's not impacting every way. We're just, in fact, probably becoming more competitive with more dependency on that type of stuff, so it's going to be weird. We've got to get our act together if that's going to come. And then like the green bill that was supposed to be there, that's another one. That would, if they would have had, full reign on what some of those proposals were and stuff, that may have drastically changed the energy business in America, but they didn't get all of that done either. So I think there's always parts, and that's big dollars. When the government's spending it, it's big dollars. So it does impact things, but it's that, and we can talk more offline, got more specific stuff about it. There was a question here.
Yeah, on my news feed today, there was an article on the value of Debbie Downer to help explain control over optimism. I'd have to say you started out a little bit today with an Alfred E. Newman attitude, which half the people in the room do not know who he was. He was a character in Mad magazine, and his attitude was, "What, me worry?" You self-corrected quite well, and you also explained what Pathfinder does in turbulent times for us, so I can sleep at night and you don't. So you took all my questions away. You did so good.
Thank you. 0708. Thanks, Lloyd. 07, 08, for those that were clients at that time, we did town halls. And so if you remember those, we did 3 of those within 6 months. And now I look back at that now, and I think about, we had like 250 people in a room in the end of 2008 when the whole world was falling around us in the financial markets. And I wasn't as seasoned as I am now. And I think, and I thought about that recently, and like the ability to stand up there and talk to people and see through this. I mean, we're all in these big things together. And so, you know, the most important thing is that, and I think there's a level of understanding that investment's long term, and then sticking to that. And people say, and I joke about this too, when we go through bad times, everybody's long term disappears. I can't tell you how many people, probably some in this room, come in and say, well, Jason, I don't have the amount of time I did 6 months ago. You know, that's not exactly the way they say it, right? But the market goes down, and so all of a sudden they're not a long-term investor anymore. Right? Then the market comes back up, and all of a sudden they're a long-term investor again. Right? So I would remind people that the market performance has nothing to do with your health unless you're watching it too much. And it might have an adverse effect on your health. So that's the kind of thing. But I appreciate that, and it is. It's something that we want to be transparent. We don't have a crystal ball. We're not going to tell you exactly what the future is going to hold. But what we are going to do is be diversified and disciplined, and we're going to try to step. This is a tongue-in-cheek department. We're going to try to step in between our clients and stupid. Right? Make sure that stupid doesn't get in there, right, and make some bad decisions. Right? That's one of our goals. But sometimes we have to check ourselves. That's why we have a great team for that. Right? If it was just one person, I've seen advisors. They get something in their head, and all of a sudden, boom, they run off that direction, and every client's portfolio looks the same. And they, whether it's gloom or doom or over optimistic or whatever that is, and our team is a lot better at making sure that we keep ourselves in check so that we can stay disciplined as well too. Other questions? I will stay around for questions. The rest of the team's here for questions. Thank you all very much. Enjoy.